As businesses look to return to pre-pandemic sales levels, more and more companies are finding creative but questionable ways to push their employees to get vaccinated. And for those who have just started heading back to the office, it is now more important than ever for working parents to know their rights as schools reopen. For more insight, we're joined by employment lawyer Lior Samfiru. Good morning, Lior. Let's dive right in with Air Canada announcing that unvaccinated employees could face termination if they don't get the shots by the end of October. They're not the only ones to roll out a policy like this, but what stands out is that they're not accommodating testing as an alternative. How concerning is this for you, especially from a human rights perspective?
Well, Candice, this has to go back to the federal government's mandate that they've announced that they're going to impose with respect to those working in the transportation sector. The federal government has said that they're going to require those in that sector to be vaccinated, but they haven't gone as far as to say that those that do not get vaccinated are going to lose their job. I think what Air Canada has done is jump the gun perhaps a bit and impose that requirement that people will lose their job. And absent a clear mandate from the federal government, that can well be discriminatory. That can well be a human rights violation if you're not allowing other people that are not vaccinated to have those COVID tests. So we would have to wait and see when and if the federal government properly and in writing announces its mandate. But I do caution other employers from taking the cue from Air Canada and all of a sudden imposing these mandatory vaccine policies with a termination as a consequence.
And let's head south of the border, where Delta Airlines in the United States has announced they'll be deducting a $200 surcharge from employees' paychecks to put towards the company's health plan. From a legal standpoint, what's your take on this? I wonder, do you think that action could be seen north of the border, and is that discriminatory as well?
Well, we've talked a lot about mandatory vaccines. I think this is another way to make vaccines somewhat mandatory by imposing this penalty that many employees will not be able to pay and feel then compelled to get the vaccine. The reality is that this could well be discrimination on what we call perceived disability. The idea, of course, being that those who may have a medical condition will be treated differently, will be made to pay more, will also not get paid leave from Delta. Yes, I do consider that to be discriminatory. We haven't seen yet companies in Canada applying this approach, and I would certainly caution them from doing so. I would be hard-pressed to see how that would not be considered discrimination and a human rights violation.
Okay, let's talk about working parents now, with schools reopening in many regions in less than 2 weeks. But there are a lot of workplaces asking employees to return to the office physically. So if there's a school outbreak, what's the best way for employees to approach their managers about staying home from work or returning to working from home?
Well, the good and the bad thing here is that because we've been living with COVID-19 for the last year and a half, both employers and employees are used to this idea that employees may have to work from home. Schools have opened and closed numerous times over the past year and a half. So I don't think employees should fear the idea of having to speak to their boss, to their manager, but needing to stay at home. Make sure that the boss understands that this has to do with COVID-19, that if there's a closure, it's not a decision that you're making to stay home, it's a necessity. I think a lot of employers, managers are being understanding, receptive, and accommodating. So you should not have that fear or be concerned about a stigma if you do have to stay home with your children.
And finally, what do you think the top 3 rights working parents should be aware of as kids return to school?
Well, the first thing you have to remember is you do have the right to stay home with your child in a job-protected leave if your child is sick, has COVID, or has to isolate. You have that legal right. The second right is you have the right to stay at home if there's no childcare, if the school is closed, if the daycare is closed. Again, a job-protected leave. And finally, if you do have to stay at home and you are able to work from home, and your employer may have the obligation to provide that accommodation, to accommodate you by allowing you to work from home, those are important rights that employees have.
Okay, thank you as always for your insight. That's employment lawyer Lior Samfiru. We'll talk again soon.